Hi, I'm Rob Smopoulos, and this is The Hilt. Today, I'm excited to have repeat guest Rob Konacki joining me. Rob was the former Director of Cybersecurity at the White House, and he's also a senior advisor here at Defendify. What we want to dive into today is discuss the new presidential executive order that came out in May of 2021, done by the Biden administration to help improve nation security. I don't think there's a better person than Rob who could share some insight here. So we're going to jump right into it and get started.
The White House dropped Executive Order 14028, improving the nation's cybersecurity. This executive order is the first major action by the Biden administration on cybersecurity following the SolarWinds incident that was revealed last December. What I want to talk about today is what the executive order does and whether it will impact you as an IT service provider or an IT security service provider. So with that, let's jump in. I'm Rob Konacki. I'm a senior advisor here at Defendify and a former director of cybersecurity at the White House. What that means is that in my old job, I used to write executive orders like this. So I can give you a little bit of the behind the scenes of how something like this comes together and what it will mean for federal agencies and for the cybersecurity industry as a whole. So it was released May 12th, 2021. This executive order is massive. It's about 8,000 words. It prints out to about 18 pages. Most executive orders are usually in the neighborhood of 2 to 4 pages and maybe 2,000 or so words. So this is a beast. This is also the kind of executive order, being this long, that would normally take almost 2 years to run through the process. So the fact that it came out in the first 6 months of the Biden administration alone is impressive. It came out with a very heavy hand in terms of forcing federal agencies to take action, and they clearly want to move very quickly. So they push to get this executive order out quickly. They're going to then push federal agencies to move quickly to implement that. And so we'll talk about the timelines attached to each piece of this. Basically, though it's called an executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, it's really focused on improving the security of federal civilian agencies, Treasury, Transportation, Veterans Affairs. Secondarily, it's focused on the Department of Defense, but really it's primarily about federal civilian agencies. It also looks to use the Federal Acquisition Authority, the ability to spend money to shape markets, right? The federal government is the largest IT purchaser in the world by a lot. And so a longstanding tool of government has been to use that acquisition authority to direct changes that they want to see in the broader market. And so we're going to see a lot of that in this executive order. First things first, bottom line up front, will it impact you? Do you work at a federal agency on IT or IT security? If so, yes, it is absolutely going to impact you. It is directed at you. Are you an IT provider to the federal government? If so, it is definitely going to impact you. There are going to be changes to federal acquisition regulations and processes that are going to impact you if you service the federal government in any way. If you were an IT security provider to the federal government, there are going to be special requirements for you in terms of you having to report events that you detect, not only to the agency that you are contracted with, but also to the federal government at large, principally CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security. If you sell software to the federal government, it is absolutely going to impact you. You are going to get hit with a new set of requirements to secure your build processes and to ensure that your software does not have known vulnerabilities in it when you release it. If none of these things are true, it will not directly impact you. So you don't need to worry about any of the timelines that we'll talk about in this presentation. All right, so some basics. What's an executive order? Well, an executive order is a presidential action, right? It is the president directing federal agencies to do things. It is also secondarily a policy instrument, meaning that the president is saying it is the policy of the United States to go in this direction. That kind of language in the order is what's called precatory. It's sort of prayerful. It's we want these things to happen. The real meat of it is the president actually ordering federal agencies to do specific things. Some basics on that. The president really only has two authorities under the Constitution. He's a commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That's where he has the most power. If it's national security, which cybersecurity definitely is, he is at the height of his power. The second piece of the president's authority under the Constitution is he gets to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. The idea here is that if a law has been passed telling federal agencies to do something, it's the president's responsibility to make sure that they are implementing it faithfully, to doing it correctly, following the intent of Congress as expressed in the law. Now, because we've had a lot of law over the years on cybersecurity and IT at the federal level, the president has an awful lot of existing authorities that he can use to make his will done. So that's what we're seeing with this order. Again, it's really directed at federal agencies. And then from federal agencies, they're using their authorities to make changes in the marketplace when they buy technologies. The last thing I'll say, because we get a lot of questions on this usually, is does this have the same weight as law? And can the president order something to do that might not, in fact, be legal? Well, the answer is because it's grounded in statute and in the president's constitutional authorities, it has the same weight as law, assuming that the legal analysis that was done is well grounded. In other words, assuming that a lawyer walking through this at the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department can see that each piece of this executive order is tied to an authority that the president has or an agency has that he is directing to take an action. In that case, it is pretty well the same as law. All right, so what does the executive order do? Well, it's got 9 sections, but principally there are 4 things that it does. The first thing is it requires IT and IT security providers to share threat intel with CISA and to report incidents that they experience. The second thing it does is it sets requirements for federal agencies, a whole series of requirements to improve the security of federal agencies. It then sets security requirements for software vendors. I talked about this already, right? At the basic level, this is secure your development environment and make sure your software doesn't have any known vulnerabilities in it. And then finally, the last piece that I think is really significant is it establishes the idea of the Cyber Safety Review Board. This is a long-held idea that there should be something like the National Transportation Safety Board that reviews NTSB reviews aviation incidents and train crashes and major car crashes. Well, the Cyber Safety Review Board is that same idea for cybersecurity incidents. And we'll get into what that means and what's the limit of what the president was able to do under existing authority in a little while. So first piece, right? The goal of this section here is really to just make sure that the US government as a whole can see what individual agencies see and to require that IT and IT security providers are reporting incidents that those entities are experiencing to the federal government. So those are 2 requirements in the same section, section 2 of the executive order, right? The first one is kind of basic, right? And this is a long-standing problem. If you are a cybersecurity provider who has a contract with the Department of Treasury and you pick up an event at the Department of Treasury, you are not under your contract with the Department of Treasury able to share a notice of that event with the Department of Homeland Security, with the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency, CISA. And so DHS, as the main protector of federal agencies, actually doesn't have the ability right now to get that holistic picture and say, oh, look, this agency experienced an event and this agency experienced an event. So what this is doing in the first part is saying, we're going to have new contracting language We're going to make changes to the federal acquisition regulations and the defense federal acquisition regulations so that when those events happen, those contracted parties, those companies like FireEye or CrowdStrike or whoever the Treasury Department or the Veterans Affairs Department contracts with, that they not only will tell Treasury and the VA, they'll also report that back to the Department of Homeland Security. So DHS will be able to fuse together a picture of what's happening across governments. It's a minor point, but it is a major obstacle to creating situational awareness. So that's the first piece that we're going to see here. The second piece is this requirement that if you are a contractor, an IT or an IT security provider to the federal government, you're going to have to report incidents that you experience to the federal government. So this would be the case that FireEye, which went public with the SolarWinds incident because they were obligated to do so under the law because they're a public company and it had a material impact. This would say, well, when you, FireEye, experience something like that, you have to go to the federal government and tell the federal government that you've experienced an incident. The same thing with SolarWinds. Depending on how these reporting requirements are met, it could be a lot of companies having to report a lot of low-level incidents, or it could be set much, much higher only when there's a major impact. But this is a big shift. This will mean that the federal government will know about incidents that otherwise might never have come to light. So this is going to be a fairly big deal. Both these changes will get played out in updates to contract language over the next year. All right, so requirements for federal agencies. The best way to think about this is that it's just saying, look, we want federal civilian agencies to at least have as good security as the Fortune 100, as the best major corporations are investing a lot in security. They've got a whole series of best practices that are coming online now, and they want to see federal agencies adopt these same practices. So it's really about modernizing federal government cybersecurity. The big pushes here, there are three. One, moving to the cloud, getting off legacy data center environments, getting out of legacy applications and moving to cloud infrastructure and moving to cloud SaaS. That's a big push. The next push is this concept of zero trust, right? The federal government has long been criticized for having a very perimeter-focused approach to security. Here's the perimeter, everything inside it's safe, anything coming into it, we're going to inspect. That's been the modality of the federal government for a very long time. Well, zero trust is a model that Google and other leading IT companies have adopted. And it says, we don't really care where you are. We don't care whether you're sitting in an office or you're at a coffee shop. We're not going to trust your device depending on its location any more than any other device. And so we're going to rate all kinds of different factors for your security. We're going to lock your devices down, but we're not going to care whether or not you're behind one of our corporate firewalls or working from your home office, as many of us are doing today. So this is a big push to say federal agencies need to adopt the zero trust model. And then finally, this is a directive to say agencies need to get on board with multi-factor authentication. This, again, is a direct response to the SolarWinds campaign where FireEye discovered the incident because they had multi-factor in place and the adversary tried to get around their multi-factor authentication and their SOC team was alerted to that. So this is a recognition of something that people have known for a very long time. Multi-factor authentication is one of the strongest things you can do to defeat even advanced adversaries. And this is a push to get federal agencies to do it. There are a host of other requirements that are sprinkled throughout the end of the executive order that I think are less fundamental, kind of low-hanging fruit, but some important things. One is that CISA is charged with developing an incident response playbook, right? The CISA should have the ability to say, when these type of things happen, here's how the federal government will respond, and then we'll be able to rehearse those responses. Section 7 mandates endpoint detection and response for federal civilian agencies. So first, Section 3 says, hey, events need to get reported. Well, Section 7 says if you haven't implemented an endpoint detection and response strategy at your agency, you need to do that now. In other words, in order for the federal government to have that holistic picture, we first got to have these data collectors on each of the endpoints at your agency. So Section 7 mandates that. Section 8, super basic, logging requirements. You're going to log events on your networks, and you're going to store them in a way that they can be reviewed during incident response. This is the kind of cybersecurity 101 that is in every best practice guide and that the federal government has not been practicing. So Section 8 mandates it. Finally, Section 9 essentially says, look, everything we're doing on the federal civilian side, it should also be done on national security systems, on classified systems. These are good practices. They should be evaluated, and they should also be done on national security systems. It's kind of a little bit inside baseball. Okay, software supply chain security. This is what's gotten a lot of attention. What this order does is it uses the power of the federal procurement purse in order to make widespread changes to the way software is developed. So if you don't sell your software to the federal government, this does not apply to you and this will not affect you. However, if you are a major software vendor, this is going to affect you because the federal government is a big part of the market you're going after. This has been calibrated, I would judge, in such a way so that no companies are going to say, well, if you're going to make us do this, we're going to exit the federal market. It's been calibrated in such a way that every company said, okay, we probably should be doing all these things anyway. We will start to do them now. We will recognize that all our competitors are under the same obligations so that if it introduces friction into the development process, if it slows down our builds, that's okay because it happens to everybody. And so this, while it is targeted at federal acquisitions, it's using that federal acquisition authority in order to force private companies to do something. It's going to have a massive, massive effect. A lot of the requirements, as I said, are things that you should be expected to do anyway. They're in every best practice guide that has ever been developed for enterprise cybersecurity, for software development. There are a couple pieces of it that are a little more advanced, a little new to the market, but they're things that have been out there for a while. So two of these are, one, the software bill of materials. And this is an idea that the Commerce Department has been pushing for a long time, and some outside experts have been pushing for a long time. It basically says, look, when you develop a piece of software, you need to list out the open source components that you use to assemble that software, so that at a later date, when a vulnerability is found in one of those open source components, it's known that it's there, and you will go back and fix it. And your purchasers of your software will know that they have this vulnerability embedded in your software. The second piece here is an encouragement to develop the idea of essentially nutrition labels for IoT. So for the Internet of Things, the idea is that when you buy a new home camera, you should get the equivalent of that nutrition label on the back of a cereal box that will say, this meets the following requirements. It's been tested by these organizations. It has these kinds of application armoring enabled on it. And then you can feel more secure that you're buying a IoT product that you may be bringing into your home or bringing into your enterprise and knowing that it's secure. So again, these are ideas that have been out there for a long time. This executive order is putting a lot of weight behind them to move them forward. Okay, the last major piece here is the establishment of the Cyber Safety Review Board. So again, the Cyber Safety Review Board is the idea that when there's a plane crash, the National Transportation Safety Board investigates. And TSB shows up, they put yellow tape around the crash site, they figure out what happened, they decode the black box, they talk to witnesses, and then they issue a report. And the report's aimed at preventing that kind of crash from ever happening again. We don't have that in cybersecurity. Even 5 months after we found out about SolarWinds, details of how that incident occurred are still trickling out. And there are pieces of it that we may never know the truth of, because either A, they were never investigated, or B, they were investigated, but they were done so under legal privilege by lawyers, by companies that don't want those details released because they could be embarrassing to them. And so the idea with the Cyber Safety Review Board is that the government probably should come in and investigate significant incidents and then report out on what changes should be made to best practices, to regulations, or to specific organization cybersecurity practices. And so that's what Section 5 does. It establishes the Cyber Safety Review Board. Now, as I said at the top of this, everything in this executive order is bound by the president's existing authorities. And so this Cyber Safety Review Board is set up at the Department of Homeland Security as a public-private partnership under a section of the Homeland Security Act that allows for public-private voluntary collaboration. It will have private sector members. It will have a chair who is from the private sector and a chair who is from government. And it will not have the ability, at least initially, to force anybody to reveal anything they do not want to share. So nobody is going to show up at FireEye or SolarWinds, knock on their door, and start demanding documents and log files and taking witness statements. That's not going to happen. Everything that's going to happen here is going to be on a voluntary and cooperative basis. The first thing that the EO charges this body with doing is investigating SolarWinds, putting out recommendations in response to SolarWinds, reviewing the incident and coming together as a board and saying, here are the changes we think need to be made based on this incident. So it's not going to be a deep investigation by any means. It's on a fairly tight time frame, but it is absolutely a very good start to a very old idea that was first proposed in 1991 and is well overdue for implementation. The next thing that the EO does on this subject is it directs the board to, after it has completed its 90-day review of SolarWinds, of that event, is to, in 30 days, make recommendations on how to improve the processes. And that report could involve things like recommending subpoena authority. We don't know. We have no idea what this board will decide is necessary for it to function well. But this is going to be, I think, a significant new source of valuable data on cyber incidents. It also gives the Secretary of Homeland Security and the President the authority to stand up a new investigation when they deem fit, or anytime a unified coordination group, DHS's public-private body for coordinating major cyber incidents, is stood up. So we should expect to see that this board will review at least a series of cyber incidents each year and try and put out something definitive on what happened, why, and how it can be prevented from happening again. All right, timelines. For the IT service provider requirements on event notification and incident reporting, remember two things, right? We saw an event at a federal agency. We're going to report it to CISA. And we experienced an event ourselves. We had an incident at our company, and we have to report that to the federal government. There is a timeline that stretches out for over a year on each of these pieces. But in the coming months, there are a couple of very important moments that are worth looking out for. So the first is June 26, 45 days after the report was released, DHS is going to propose incident reporting requirements. So they're going to publish, here's what we think those requirements should be. Those will be put out. They'll be taken by the FAR, and then they will, on September 26, be released for public comment. So at that point, you will be able to go back to the FAR and say, I think these incident reporting requirements are ridiculous. I think these incident reporting requirements are good. They're too narrow. They're too vague. Whatever your view is, you'll be able to do that. On July 11th, on the issue of event reporting, right? You are an IT security provider. You monitor federal networks. On July 11th, OMB will propose updates to the FAR on that piece of it. So you'll see what that new contracting language could be. On October 10th, that will open for public comment. And so you'll be able to, at that point, say, I think that these event reporting requirements are ludicrous. I think they're great. I think this is going to help us be a better partner to the federal government. I will exit the federal market if you make me do this. Whatever your view is, October 10th will be your opportunity to say that. Now, for the supply chain components, there's a series of actions over the next year that will eventually get us to new requirements in the FAR for software supply chain security. So the first thing is June 11th, if you want to provide input on the guidelines that NIST has to develop, those are due June 11th. So you've got a couple weeks to get your input. NIST is asking that your input be short. They're asking that it be 2 pages maximum and that it be concise because they've got a very quick turnaround time. A month later, on July 11th, NIST has to issue minimum standards for software testing, and then they need to take your input from June 11th, those requirements for software testing, and on November 8th, they need to issue preliminary guidelines, non-binding preliminary guidelines for supply chain software security. Then there's a few month period while NIST will continue to receive comment before they have to put out final guidance that will incorporate everything that they have learned since the start of this process. That guidance, in turn, will be taken by federal agencies to use in procurement. So by March 8th, federal agencies have to take the guidance and they need to incorporate it into their procurement processes and start using it in the selection of software. On May 12th, DHS actually has the responsibility for taking everything that NIST has done and any feedback from agencies on the use of this guidance and making recommendations to the FAR Council to update the requirements for figuring out how these vendors would attest to meeting the guidance. So they'll make those recommendations to the FAR Council by May 12th of 2022. And at that point, it will be up to the FAR to go through the process of updating those requirements with the normal notice and comment periods before we get fully binding new FAR clauses in play. For the Cyber Safety Review Board, the report on SolarWinds is due 90 days after the Secretary of Homeland Security establishes the board. We don't actually know if the secretary has done that, if that was done the day the executive order happened, or if we're waiting for another action by the secretary on this. So it could be that the report will be due out by August 10th. It's also possible that at some later date, the Secretary of Homeland Security is going to say, I have created this board, here are the people on it, now starts the 90-day clock. So we don't know which of those is the truth of the matter at this point. Whenever that report starts, whenever that 90-day clock begins, 30 days after that, the Cyber Safety Review Board has to put out their recommendations on how to improve their processes, how they need to be funded, what their staffing needs to look like, if there are changes that should be made from the executive order, if they need new authorities from Congress. That report will be due 30 days after. Now, reminding everybody that this also kicked off a process whereby anytime there's a major cyber incident where the Unified Coordination Group is pulled together, there will be a review of that by the Cyber Safety Review Board, or whenever the president or the Secretary of Homeland Security determines that one is needed. So we may see many of these over the next year. We just don't know. Because the board probably has not been formed at this point, it's unlikely that they will automatically trigger reviews of major incidents from the past couple months. So Colonial Pipeline, for instance, the Hafnium vulnerabilities exposed in Microsoft Exchange, these probably will not automatically trigger a cyber safety review board. But again, that would be up to the discretion of the president or the secretary to determine that those might be necessary. So all in all, this is a massive, massive executive order. It is likely to fundamentally shift much of how the federal government approaches cybersecurity. It is undoubtedly going to impact anybody who sells IT or IT security to the federal government. It will have downstream effects because the federal government is the largest purchaser of IT services in the world. It's likely to have that broader impact on the market. It also has set some very aggressive timelines. So we should expect to see federal agencies moving out very quickly to try and get on top of what they've been assigned to in this order. And they're likely to be reaching out to the cybersecurity and the IT community for their input on how to implement these. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for shaping the outcome from this executive order over the next couple of months. And it will be a good idea, if you are impacted by this executive order directly, for you to engage in that process. There are going to be opportunities to shape it. That input will be welcomed. And I would, as somebody who has been on the other end of this, I would encourage you to do so. That kind of feedback, that kind of industry insight is desperately needed by the professionals in government who are trying to figure out how to put all of this in place. Thanks for listening today. I'm Rob Konaki with Defendify, and good luck securing your networks.